Is this sword a Chinese katana? Hey everybody, it's the Scholar General Mo Jian. Today we're going to be taking a look at the LK Chen Woyaodao. Now before we get started, I have a few things to say. Number one, I know that it's been a while since I released my latest video, and I just want to let everybody know that, I'm still working hard making content, trying to do a lot of work behind the scenes to improve my video production, and a lot of research is going on. So just hang in there and keep watching my videos as they come out, because more are coming. In addition to that, I'd also like to say up front that, like many of these swords that I've been reviewing recently, this one has been sent to me not to stay with me. It's not a sword that I own, but it is a sword that I will return after I've reviewed it and made some videos with it. In this video, first I'm going to talk about the history of this sword design and whether or not it is a Chinese katana. What does that even mean? Is that possible? And then I'm going to go on and talk about how does this sword actually move and feel, and do some cutting with it. LK Chen calls this sword a Woyaodao, and Woyaodao is a Ming Dynasty term that was used to describe swords which had a Japanese style or were directly imported from Japan. And the term Wo literally means dwarf. It was used as a derogatory word for Japanese people and during the Ming Dynasty. And then Yao is your waist, and Dao is the single-bladed sword or saber. So Woyaodao literally means, dwarf waist sword. Basically, swords that are either from Japan or have a Japanese design in China. Although some people are sometimes reluctant to admit this, both Chinese and Japanese swords have a long shared history of mutually influencing one another. For example, we have swords in Japan which date all the way back to the Tang Dynasty, and later on during the Song, we actually have the famous Chinese prose writer and historian Ouyang Xiu. He writes the Riben Daoge, which is like a song praising the qualities of Japanese swords. However, the story of the Woyaodao really takes off during the Ming Dynasty. We know that there were frequent tribute missions from Japan to China during this time period, and over time these started to ship a lot of swords, not just for official tribute but also for trading on the side. And for example, from the beginning of the 15th into the early 16th century, we know that over 100,000 swords were sent into China, and that's a lot. However, in reality, the number of Japanese blades getting into China was probably much larger, because these are just the number that we have on paper. We actually don't know how many were, smuggled into China, and there was a lot of smuggling going on during this period. Many people who watch my channel will know that the Ming Dynasty had a big pirate problem towards, the mid-Ming, and many of these pirates were Japanese, and they would bring their swords with them, and we have accounts and documented interaction of Japanese martial arts and Japanese weapons in China. However, it's important to keep in mind that even though there's a bunch of Japanese swords moving into China, and there's a bunch of Chinese swords being made that imitate Japanese swords, it's still a minority of Dao that are existing during the Ming Dynasty, because the Ming Dynasty was very massive, and at certain points they had their military well over 1 million soldiers, and that doesn't even count the militias and all the other armed people that were out there. So it's a very sizable section of Dao that would be, Japanese style, but it's not even close to a majority. And there's also, Central Asian designs that are getting into the Ming Dynasty. So there's a very diverse sword culture at the time, and, the Japanese swords are a big part of that. During this period, we also have many authors and military writers, such as famous General Qi Jiguang, who fought the Wo Ko, and he remarked that the quality and the steel of Japanese blades was quite excellent, and some have taken this to mean that the swords produced in Japan would be metallurgically superior to swords made in China during the Ming Dynasty. However, this is a big topic, and I don't want to get into all the details now, but it's much more complex than I think most people who comment about it are letting on, and there's a lot to unpack there, and I plan to make a video about that in the future. But we're going to continue on, and now we're going to look at this sword design in particular. Right here, I just want to let everybody know that this sword does come with a scabbard. I just didn't show it yet. And, this scabbard is perfectly usable and pretty nice. It does come with some imitation ray skin, and, it's black. It has a nice color. The iron fittings are quite good. However, let's talk about what everybody really wants to see, which is the sword itself. LK Chen designed and produced this sword based on a blade that Peter Decker had in his collection, a few years ago. And it's important to know that although, LK Chen was able to see all the images of the sword, he did not get to handle that sword himself because, it's owned in a private collection now. So it's no longer available for people to just go find. First, we look at the palm on the grip. We can see that it has right angles all the way around. And this is actually the fang shi, or the square style. This style came in during the late Ming and, continued on into the mid-Qing dynasty before it faded out into the round style, or the yuan shi. However, something that's very unique about the grip of this sword is the forward cant as well as the length. So here we have a single-handed sword. This sword does not feel comfortable to use with two hands. It's a single-handed sword, but it has a little bit of extra length on the grip, and it also, curves forwards. And that's quite interesting. We don't have a whole lot of information on, how many blades had curved tangs and curved handles during this time period, during the late Ming. But we do have some art which shows these sabers with curved handles, and there are also many Central Asian swords floating around China during this time period, so it's possible that this curved handle could have, some inspiration from that. This type of hilt is pretty much a dead giveaway that the sword is actually a Chinese sword and not an actual Japanese katana. It could have, a katana blade or a tachi blade, but the handle itself is very Chinese in style. And this continues on if we look at the husho, or the disc guard, the tsuba. Although there was massive trade in disc guards during this period, both to and from Japan, this one is clearly a pretty standard run-of-the-mill Chinese-style disc guard. Moving up from the disc guard, we have the blade collar, or the tunko. And this tunko style is also not found in Japan. Japanese habaki are completely flat across the top, but many Chinese tunko, have this leading part on the edge, and this is a feature which we can trace all the way from the Avar Khaganate in Eastern Europe, and it found its way all the way into China over centuries. We've talked about the hilt and the fittings. Now let's move up and talk about the blade itself. Because this is a Woyaodao, which means that it's either a blade made in Japan or it's a blade made in imitation of Japanese swords. I'm actually going to use some Japanese terminology to describe the profile and stuff that we see here. However, this is not my main field. I could be getting a couple things wrong. If I do, make sure you tell me down below, because I value the truth being out there, especially if I'm making mistakes. The most common blade profiles found on katana are shinogi tsukuri, which means you have a ridge running along the blade, and this ridge is closer to the spine than it is to the edge. And then at the tip, you have a line where it has been ground in a different direction, and that's called the yokote. However, on this sword, there is no yokote. So there's no line where it's been ground differently. It just smoothly curves over into the kisaki, or the tip. And that is because it's not a shinogi tsukuri, it's actually a shobu tsukuri. So shobu tsukuri is basically the same thing as shinogi tsukuri, but you lack the yokote. On both shinogi and shobu tsukuri, you can have ridge lines, the middle ridge, which is very prominent, and it makes almost a diamond profile on the sword. Or you can have ones that are quite flat, where the flat of the blade is, runs parallel, and then there's a bevel which tapers into the edge. In addition, this sword has a completely flat spine, and this is called a kakumune, or a hiramune. On many Japanese blades, you'll have a shinogi tsukuri, and the ridge line is usually not as flat as this one, and the spine will usually have a ridge running along it. However, in China, many Woyaodao tend to have a shobu tsukuri, which exists in Japan, but it's not quite as common. In addition, having flat spines on your dao or your, nihonto seems to be more common in China than in Japan. So the construction of this blade has a lot of Japanese design. However, it's not necessarily the most common type of construction that you'll find on many nihonto or Japanese blades. Does that mean that this is a Chinese katana? And what does Chinese katana even mean? Go down in the comments below and let's have a friendly debate about it. Now let's talk a little bit about the handling. So much of the time, whenever you have a long hilt like this, it will take mass and put it down into the hilt and make the blade feel lighter. But on this sword, you still have quite a bit of mass out in the blade. And that's actually good if you want to cut things. It's good for doing heavy strikes. It's not always the most maneuverable, but it still feels very authoritative and like you can really dish out some damage. In addition, this blade is around 30 inches long, which gives you pretty decent reach. And Peter Decker, who owned the original, actually speculated that this would be a cavalry saber. And I think that's very plausible. It's difficult to say for sure with these things, but given the length and the curvature on the hilt, there's a few features which, would be advantageous when you're riding on horse. I should say that I do feel like the angular style grip on the Woyaodao can dig into your fingers a little bit, and you can feel those corners. It's still not that bad, but it's not quite as good as it was on the LK Chen Woyaodao. So I think that, if these corners were just smoothed out a little bit, it would really help things. So I tried using a saber with a Manchu thumb ring, the archery ring. It doesn't feel the most comfortable all the time, but it's perfectly functional and usable. And you can see here that I'm trying to do these, strikes from horse stance as if you're riding on a horse. As expected, this sword is excellent at cutting, and it's also a lot of fun to swing around. So if anybody's interested in picking up a Chinese katana, then I highly recommend, going to LK Chen's site. It'll be linked down below, and go ahead and purchase one for yourself. Thank you all for watching. Please subscribe and don't forget to stay sharp.